Alara wiped the sweat from her brow, the sterile scent of antiseptic clinging to her scrubs as she moved between the rows of patients. The hospital was a sprawling labyrinth of glass and steel, its walls humming with the faint vibrations of alien technology. She had always prided herself on her ability to keep up with the relentless pace of modern medicine, but lately, it felt like the world was moving too fast for her to catch up. The AI systems, sleek and efficient, had taken over most of the diagnostic work, and the alien medtechs, with their glowing tools and incomprehensible languages, were handling the rest. Alara was human, just human, and in this new world that felt like a liability. She paused at the bedside of an elderly man, his face pale against the stark white sheets. His chart had been updated by the AI, a cold list of numbers and probabilities that didn't account for the way his hands trembled or the fear in his eyes. Alara reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He smiled weakly, the lines on his face deepening. "Better now that you're here, Nurse Alara," he said. She returned the smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She knew what was coming. The summons came an hour later, delivered by a holographic assistant that materialized at the nurse's station. "Alara Voss, report to administration immediately," it intoned, its voice devoid of inflection. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she made her way to the elevators, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The administration office was on the top floor, a place she had only been once before when she was hired. The memory of that day, full of hope and determination, felt like a lifetime ago. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a sleek, minimalist room dominated by a large desk. Behind it sat Director Krell, a tall, angular figure with skin that shimmered faintly in the light. He was not human, though he had adopted a humanoid form for convenience. His eyes, multifaceted and unreadable, fixed on her as she entered. "Nurse Voss," he said, his voice smooth and precise. "Please sit." Alara obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She knew what was coming, had seen it happen to others, but that didn't make it any easier. "The hospital is undergoing a restructuring," Krell began, his tone clinical. "Advances in AI and alien medical technology have made certain roles redundant. Unfortunately, your position is among them." The words hit her like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. "I understand," she said, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. Krell nodded, as if her compliance was a foregone conclusion. "You will be given a severance package and assistance in finding new employment," he continued, sliding a data pad across the desk. "Thank you for your service." Alara took the pad, her fingers brushing against the cool surface. She stood, her legs feeling strangely unsteady, and turned to leave. The door slid shut behind her with a finality that made her chest ache. She walked through the hospital one last time, her eyes lingering on the faces of the patients she had cared for, the colleagues she had worked alongside. None of them noticed her passing. She was already a ghost. The city outside was a cacophony of noise and light, the air thick with the scent of exhaust and the hum of hovercraft. Alara walked aimlessly, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What would she do now? Where would she go? She had dedicated her life to helping others, but now it seemed there was no place for her in this new world. The thought was unbearable. She found herself on the outskirts of the city, where the buildings gave way to dense forest. The air was cleaner here, the noise of the city fading into the background. She walked deeper into the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath her feet a comforting rhythm. The forest was a place of solace, a reminder of a simpler time. She had always loved the quiet, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground with golden light. It was there, in the heart of the forest, that she found the dragon. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a figment of her exhausted mind. But as she drew closer, the creature came into focus. It was massive, its scales shimmering with an iridescent glow that shifted in the sunlight. His body was sleek and powerful, but there was something wrong. One of its wings was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a deep gash ran along its side, oozing a dark, viscous fluid. The creature's eyes, large and luminous, met hers, and she felt a jolt of something. Fear, awe, she couldn't tell. Alara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen anything like it, not in person. Dragons were the stuff of legends, creatures from distant worlds that few humans ever encountered. And yet, here it was, wounded and alone. She took a cautious step forward, her training kicking in despite her fear. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm here to help." The dragon let out a low, rumbling sound, more vibration than noise, and she felt it in her bones. It was a sound of pain, but also of trust. She moved closer, her hands outstretched. "I'm a nurse," she said, as if the creature could understand her. "I can help you." The dragon's eyes never left hers as she approached, its breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. She knelt beside it, her hands hovering over the wound. The scales were warm to the touch, and she could feel the faint pulse of life beneath them. She reached into her bag, pulling out the few medical supplies she had brought with her. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The wound was deep, but the dragon's physiology was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its blood was thick and dark, clotting almost instantly as she applied pressure. She cleaned the wound as best she could, using strips of cloth from her bag to bind it. The dragon remained still, its eyes never leaving her face. When she was done, she sat back, her hands trembling. The dragon let out a soft rumble, its head lowering until it was level with hers. She felt a strange warmth in her mind, a sensation that was both foreign and familiar. "Thank you," the voice said, not in words but in feelings, images. She saw herself through the dragon's eyes, a small, determined figure bathed in golden light. She saw gratitude, trust, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. The dragon's name was Zirith, she learned, though the knowledge came to her in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. It was a royal, a being of great importance in its world, though it offered no explanation for how it had come to be here, wounded and alone. Alara didn't press. There would be time for questions later. For now, she sat beside the dragon, her hand resting lightly on its scales. The forest was quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She felt a strange sense of peace, as if the world had shifted on its axis and everything had fallen into place. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Alara woke to the sound of birdsong, the forest around her bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. She blinked, disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back. The dragon, Zirith, lay beside her, its massive form rising and falling with each steady breath. The wound on its side was still visible, but the bleeding had stopped, and the edges of the gash were beginning to knit together. She marveled at the creature's resilience, its alien physiology far more advanced than anything she had encountered in her years as a nurse. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the forest floor. Zirith's eyes opened, their luminous depths fixing on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The connection between them was still there, a faint hum in the back of her mind, like the echo of a distant song. She felt a surge of gratitude from the dragon, warm and reassuring, and she smiled despite herself. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Zirith shifted, its scales rippling like liquid metal in the sunlight. It let out a low rumble, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath her. She felt another wave of images and emotions, this time more focused. Zirith was trying to communicate something, a warning, perhaps, or a plea. She frowned, trying to make sense of it, but the message was fragmented, like a puzzle missing crucial pieces. Before she could ask for clarification, a sound broke the stillness of the forest. It was faint at first, a distant hum that grew louder with each passing second. Alara turned her head, scanning the treeline, her heart beginning to race. The sound was familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. It wasn't until the first starship broke through the canopy that she realized what it was. The ship was unlike anything she had ever seen, its sleek, silver hull gleaming in the sunlight. It moved with a grace that belied its size, hovering silently above the treetops before descending into the clearing. Alara scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. Starships didn't just land in the middle of the forest. Not unless something was very wrong. Zirith let out a low growl, its body tensing as it rose to its full height. The dragon's wings unfurled, casting a shadow over the clearing, and Alara felt a surge of protectiveness from the creature. It was shielding her, she realized, though from what, she didn't know. The starship's hatch opened with a soft hiss, and a figure emerged. It was humanoid, tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like polished obsidian. Its eyes, large and almond-shaped, glowed faintly in the dim light. It wore a uniform of some kind, sleek and form-fitting, with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as it moved. The figure stepped onto the forest floor, its movements fluid and deliberate, and Alara felt a chill run down her spine. "Alara Vas," the figure said, its voice smooth and melodic. "You are summoned." She stared at the figure, her mind struggling to process what was happening. "Summoned?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "By who?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned its gaze to Zirith, its expression unreadable. The dragon let out another growl, this one deeper and more menacing, but the figure didn't flinch. "The Draconian Empire thanks you for your service," it said, addressing Zirith directly. "Your safe return is our highest priority." Alara's breath caught in her throat. Draconian Empire? She had heard the name before, in passing, but it had always seemed like something out of a fairy tale. A distant mythical civilization that few humans had ever encountered. And yet, here was one of its representatives, standing in front of her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Alara's heart pounded in her chest. Honored? By an alien empire? It sounded absurd, and yet the figure's tone left no room for doubt. She glanced at Zirith, searching for confirmation, and the dragon nodded. A slow, deliberate movement that sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could respond, the figure stepped aside, gesturing toward the starship. "Please," it said, "we must depart." Alara hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had no ties to this world, not anymore. Her job was gone, her future uncertain. And yet, the idea of leaving everything behind, of stepping onto an alien starship and flying off to who knows where, was terrifying. She looked at Zirith, the creature's eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her chest ache. The dragon had trusted her, and now it was asking her to trust it in return. She took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing in her mind. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I'll go." The figure nodded, its expression unreadable, and turned back toward the starship. Alara followed, her footsteps hesitant but determined. Zirith fell into step beside her, its massive form moving with a grace that belied its size. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they approached the ship, the air thick with anticipation. The interior of the starship was unlike anything Alara had ever seen. The walls were smooth and metallic, but they seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The air was cool and crisp, with a faint scent that reminded her of ozone. She stepped inside, her eyes wide with wonder, and the hatch closed behind her with a soft hiss. The figure led her to a spacious chamber, its walls lined with what looked like control panels, though they bore no buttons or switches. Instead, the surfaces were smooth and featureless, responding to the figure's touch with a faint glow. Alara sat down on a cushioned seat, her hands gripping the edges as the ship began to rise. Through a large viewport, she watched as the forest receded below, the trees shrinking until they were little more than a sea of green. The sky darkened as they ascended, the stars coming into view one by one. She felt a lump form in her throat as the reality of what was happening sank in. She was leaving Earth, perhaps for good, and she had no idea what awaited her on the other side. Zirith settled beside her, its massive form taking up most of the space in the chamber. The dragon's presence was a comfort, its warmth and strength a reminder that she wasn't alone. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on its scales, and felt a surge of gratitude from the creature. It was thanking her, she realized, not just for saving its life, but for trusting it. The starship accelerated, the stars outside blurring into streaks of light. Alara leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with questions. What would she find in the Draconian Empire? Would she be welcomed, or would she be an outsider, a human among beings far more advanced than herself? And what role would Zirith play in all of this? She didn't have answers, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. She had spent her life helping others, and now, perhaps, she would have the chance to do so on a scale she had never imagined. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, but she clung to it, letting it anchor her as the starship carried her toward the unknown. As the ship hurtled through the void, Alara closed her eyes, her hand still resting on Zirith's scales. The dragon's presence was a steady, reassuring weight beside her, and she felt a sense of calm settle over her. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same determination and compassion that had guided her all her life. And for now, that was enough. The starship's descent was smooth, almost imperceptible, but Alara felt the shift in her bones as they approached their destination. Through the viewport, the Draconian homeworld came into view, a planet of swirling blues and greens, its surface dotted with shimmering cities that glowed like jewels against the dark expanse of space. She leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. It was beautiful, otherworldly in a way that defied description. Zirith stirred beside her, its massive form shifting as it rose to its full height. The dragon's eyes were fixed on the viewport, its expression unreadable, but Alara felt a surge of emotion through their connection. Pride, longing, and something deeper, more complex. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on its scales, and felt a pulse of reassurance in return. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The starship touched down with a soft thud, the hatch opening to reveal a scene that took Alara's breath away. They had landed in a vast courtyard, its floor made of a material that seemed to shimmer like liquid silver. Towering structures rose around them, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns of light and color. The air was filled with a low hum, the sound of a civilization far more advanced than anything she had ever known. A group of figures approached, their movements graceful and deliberate. They were Draconians, their forms humanoid but with subtle differences, scales that shimmered in the light, eyes that glowed with an inner fire, and an aura of power that made the air around them seem to vibrate. At their head was a figure taller than the rest, its presence commanding and regal. Alara felt a jolt of recognition as the figure's eyes met hers, and she realized with a start that this was Zirith's kin. The figure inclined its head, a gesture of respect that sent a ripple through the assembled crowd. "Alara Vas," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "We are in your debt." Alara swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had expected gratitude, perhaps even a formal ceremony, but the weight of the moment was overwhelming. She glanced at Zirith, searching for guidance, and the dragon nodded. A slow, deliberate movement that seemed to convey more than words ever could. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling but clear. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just helped someone in need." The figure's expression softened, and Alara felt a surge of warmth through their connection. "To us, your actions were extraordinary," it said. "You saved the life of a royal heir, and for that, you will always have a place among us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alara felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent her life feeling like an outsider, like she didn't belong, and now, here she was, being welcomed into a world she had never imagined. The figure stepped aside, gesturing toward the towering structure behind them. "Come," it said. "There is much to discuss." Alara followed, her footsteps hesitant but determined. Zirith fell into step beside her, its massive form drawing curious glances from the assembled Draconians. She felt a surge of protectiveness from the dragon, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this strange new world. The interior of the structure was even more breathtaking than the courtyard. The walls seemed to pulse with light, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns that reminded her of the Starship's control panels. The air was cool and crisp, with a faint scent that reminded her of the forest where she had found Zirith. She felt a pang of homesickness, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of wonder. They were led to a spacious chamber, its walls lined with what looked like holographic displays. The figure, Zirith's kin, gestured for her to sit, and she obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Zirith settled beside her, its presence a steady, reassuring weight. "You have questions," the figure said, its tone gentle but firm. "Ask them." Alara hesitated, her mind racing. There were so many things she wanted to know, so many things she didn't understand. But one question rose above the rest, demanding to be answered. "Why was Zirith on Earth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure's expression darkened, and Alara felt a surge of anger through their connection. "Zirith was attacked," it said, its voice low and dangerous, "by poachers who sought to profit from its scales. They are a scourge, a blight on the galaxy, and they will be dealt with." The days that followed were a blur of activity. Alara was given a place to live, a spacious chamber with walls that seemed to pulse with light. She was introduced to the Draconian healers, beings of immense knowledge and skill who welcomed her with open arms. She trained under their guidance, learning about their unique physiology and advanced medical techniques. It was challenging, but she threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised even herself. Zirith was often by her side, its presence a constant source of comfort and strength. The dragon's wound healed quickly, its scales regaining their iridescent glow. It seemed to thrive in its home environment, its movements more fluid and graceful than ever. But Alara sensed a restlessness in the creature, a tension that hadn't been there before. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alara felt a surge of fear, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of resolve. She had spent her life helping others, and now, perhaps, she would have the chance to do so on a scale she had never imagined. She nodded, her decision crystallizing in her mind. "We fight," she agreed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Alara trained alongside the Draconian warriors, learning to use their advanced weapons and technology. It was grueling work, but she threw herself into it with a determination that surprised even herself. Zirith was often by her side, its presence a constant source of comfort and strength. The day of the mission dawned bright and clear. Alara stood in the courtyard, her heart pounding in her chest. The Draconian warriors were assembled around her, their forms sleek and powerful. Zirith stood at her side, its massive form radiating strength and determination. The figure, Zirith's kin, stepped forward, its expression unreadable but its emotions clear. "Today we strike back," it said, its voice low and dangerous. "For Zirith, for our people, for the galaxy." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alara felt a surge of fear, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of resolve. She had spent her life helping others, and now, perhaps, she would have the chance to do so on a scale she had never imagined. The starship lifted off with a soft hum, the city receding below as they ascended into the sky. Alara sat in the chamber, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Zirith settled beside her, its presence a steady, reassuring weight. As the ship hurtled through the void, Alara closed her eyes, her hand resting on Zirith's scales. The dragon's presence was a steady, reassuring weight beside her, and she felt a sense of calm settle over her. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same determination and compassion that had guided her all her life. And for now, that was enough.